All right, good afternoon, everyone. I have 1 o'clock here on my watch, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to one of the webinars of our Inspired Week webinar program, which is really exciting. And we're here to talk about primary reading tips. So to first kind of introduce myself, let you know a little bit about me. My name is Rebecca Bush. I'm the primary program director here at Baker & Bloom. I was a classroom teacher for a number of years before joining the Baker & Bloom family. I'm from the US, so I taught there. I taught in Latin America, as well as here in Hong Kong. I have 2 master's degrees. So my first is in elementary education from the University of Alabama. And that was really focused on primarily bilingual programs and that language acquisition process. And my second master's is in advanced literacy. So I am a certified reading specialist, as well as a special education teacher, a classroom teacher, and a bilingual instructor. And I've now done over 200 hours of training in multisensory intervention, which basically means that I'm a dyslexia therapist. So long story short, I really love teaching reading, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So now that you know a little bit about me, to tell you a little bit about Baker & Bloom. So we are an education center located here in Wan Chai. And we have a number of different programs, but they all revolve around our 4-leaf approach. So as a team, we decided that these were the 4 things that we really wanted to instill in our programs and in our learners. And part of our mission is really about that creative literacy. So these are the pictures that I put together for my definition of creative literacy. I see it as a flexible mindset that you can use to approach any problem in order to think laterally and then be able to share your thoughts and your process. We have in the primary program, this is our keystone program, the Inspired Reader and Writer Project, which I'll actually be talking about quite a bit more in depth later this evening at 6, if you're coming back then. But it's designed to be a one-stop shop for everything that kids need at that age: language, foundational skills, reading strategies, writing, whatever it is for their age group. We also have other programs. So we have creative writing, which is really exciting to be offering this year and last year, the Inspired STEM and public speaking. We also have some more of the kind of traditional academic ones: test prep, admissions coaching, and that academic coaching is that one-on-one or small group, highly personalized for exactly what that kid or group of kids needs. And we have another program which is very exciting. We are actually launching a brand new bilingual primary and secondary school called Bloom Academy, which we are operating now as a pilot program, and we'll be starting next year at our new site. But to kind of get to what we're really here to talk about, reading, right? That's what we're all wondering about. So let's get started. I think this quote is really, really important because we have to remember when we're talking about reading and writing that these are not naturally occurring human phenomenons. Our brains were not naturally wired to learn to read or write. These are things that we as human beings and as a society have created over a number of centuries, really. And there's no reading part of our brain. Whenever we're reading, we're actually connecting many different pieces of our brain into a pathway. So that's something we really have to remember, that reading and writing are things that have to be taught. And I love putting this in there because when Lisa Moats, who is one of the leading experts in literacy instruction, she again and again and again says, teaching reading actually is rocket science. There is a science behind how you learn to read. And that's important. So before we get into what that process actually looks like, I think it's important to keep in mind what it might look like for each child, because every kid is totally different. And while we know a very clear continuum of the path that those kids will go through, every kid's going to go through it in slightly different ways. So I like to use the bell curve. This is something you might not have seen in a couple of years. I know I hadn't really seen it since college, actually, but this is a naturally occurring phenomenon across any population. And it's really important to keep this in mind when we're talking about reading, because you'll have these kids kind of over here to the right side of the bell curve. And those are going to be the kids who pick up a book at age 5 and they just kind of have taught themselves to read, seemingly. But most of the kids in this whole middle piece of the bell curve, they're going to have to go to school. They're going to learn their letters and sounds. They're going to have books read to them. They're going to go through that process. They need to be taught, but they'll still get there. And of course, all the way over here on the left side, you have kids who can still learn to read, but they might need to work with someone like me an hour a day, 5 days a week, every day for 2 years, but they'll still learn to read. So whenever you're thinking about your own child, just keep in mind that it really is a continuum, and think where in that population might they be falling. I always like to equate learning to read though with a roller coaster, right? It's something that you know you're going to the theme park, you've seen all these people that are already reading, you're standing in line, you're 3, 4 years old, you really want to learn to read because everybody else is doing it. And you finally get to go to school and you start to learn to read. And it's this really slow, laborious click, 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 all the way up to the top. And it can take a year or more for each kid to get to that top. But then once you're there, you're kind of off and running. And you have that click moment where you've broken the code and you're off and running, you're ready to go. But of course, as you go along, there are going to be times where there are going to be highs and lows. You might need a little bit more of a push to make it back around. But learning to read kind of is like a roller coaster. Now, this is a really important thing to keep in mind as well, because every kid is very different. And while we know what that continuum looks like, we want to go as fast as we can, but as slow as we must. So if there are ever times where we need to slow down and work through something a little bit more, come at it in a different way, we want to make sure we give kids the space to do that and develop at their own speed. All right, so now let's get into this science of reading instruction. And as I mentioned earlier, it really is a science. There are decades and decades and decades of research out there that show us exactly what needs to happen in order to learn to read. And one of the big ones, so really with reading, comprehension is our ultimate goal. We want to make sure that kids understand what they read, right? And that's what we want to make sure that we're driving towards. But kind of going back to that science of reading, one of the big ones that was out there actually came from a group of professionals. It was academics, teachers, the whole range of people, philosophers, psychologists, who got together about 25 years ago, and they reviewed all of the research that was out there. And they published their report in 2000, and since then, nobody has been able to refute their findings. And these were those 5 key pieces that they came up with when it comes to the science of learning how to read. So we'll talk about these a little bit more in depth as we go on through the program. All right, so, and one thing I forgot to mention too, if you have any questions along the way, please just drop them into the chat box. And if I don't answer them throughout the talk, I'll either get to them at the end or we'll make sure that we follow up with you, just so you know. Here's another model that I really like to look at. And I think this is really important for parents because this whole side over here on the right, this is where we're going to be coming back to a lot as we get on through the presentation. But learning to read really is a balancing act. You have on that left side, your ultimate goal, you want the kids to get to that instant word recognition. So imagine yourself as a reader, you pick up a book. You don't really have to think too much about every word that you come across the page. You just kind of read it. That's where we want our kids to get to. But in order to get there, they've got to have all of these pieces. And that's the sort of the mechanics, the decoding side, actually just reading the word on the page. Of course, that other side of the balancing act is the comprehension. Remember that comprehension is the ultimate goal. So that's where we're going to be talking a lot about as parents, because this is where you guys get to have a lot of input as to that developmental side. So the oral language base and the world knowledge, strategic thinking, so being able to piece things together, find the important parts, understand who the characters are and what's going on. This is another model that's out there from a researcher named Scarborough. I really like this one a lot because it really breaks apart the different pieces. So we're going to be talking a little bit about some of this stuff later on in the presentation, but primarily we're going to start up here with this language comprehension. Because really, if we want to talk about understanding reading, we first have to start with that understanding language. So to get into some of our actual tips, what you guys as parents can be doing. So as I was saying, that oral language base is where we want to start. So when we talk about reading or writing, it's one of these 4 domains, and they're all connected. So the reading and the listening and speaking, those are those naturally occurring human phenomenons. Unless we have some other issue that we're considering, you don't necessarily need to teach a kid how to speak. It just happens. It takes years for it to happen, but it just happens. But there are ones that go hand in hand as well. So listening and reading kind of go hand in hand because that's both of the information going into the brain. And then there's writing and speaking where it's information leaving the brain. So this is really important. That 90% is kind of the cutoff that we use for when, as a reader, whether you understand what you're reading or not. So that's why this language is really important, because they might be able to read the words on the page, but if they don't know what they mean, they're not going to understand what they're reading. And again, this was that group of people who wrote that National Reading Report in 2000. And they again and again came back with the research saying that language base has to be really, really strong. So let's talk about what that looks like. So when we talk about language, there are many different pieces. One of the first ones, particularly when kids are kind of growing up, is that receptive language piece, where the language is coming into their brain and they're understanding it, and then they're able to act upon it in some way. So two of the biggest tools we have to build that receptive language piece is through read-alouds. So sharing books with your kids, talking about the stories, looking at the pictures, all of those things are going to help them learn those new words, going to help them learn how to create those complex and compound sentences, the kind of longer, more advanced sentences. The other biggest tool we have is conversation, right? The biggest thing we can do to help develop that oral language piece is to talk, particularly when we're talking about kids who are not fluent readers yet. Talking is going to be one of your biggest tools. So just a few of the things that you guys as parents can do at home. And these are ones, some of these recommendations are certainly more for younger kids, like I Spy, Simon Says, those sorts of things, but they can carry on into the older years as well, particularly those conversations, having them explore their environment around them. And that conversation piece, you really want to be trying to talk to your kids, obviously intellectually at their level, but vocabulary wise, you can push them a little bit. So I always try to make sure that I insert at least a few more adult words into conversation so that they have that context and they understand what I'm talking about. Of course, a lot of this is around vocabulary. Vocabulary is so, so important. It's even one of those 5 pieces that we saw in that reading model. Now, this is really important. So Priscilla Vale was a researcher about, actually, first she did a lot of social emotional stuff, and then she sort of moved into reading. But I like to use this quote because there's a huge shift that happens in how we learn new vocabulary and how we learn language. And that shift happens when we become a fluent reader. So every kid is a little different, but typically that's going to be 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, around that age. Prior to that, our biggest way that we're going to learn new words is through talking. Once we become a fluent reader, we stop learning to read, and it swaps to actually reading to learn. But of course, what sometimes can happen is when we have that switch to where we're not learning to read anymore, we're reading to learn. If we're not actually reading, we're not learning. And that's where we get this, what's called the Matthew effect. So this is a term that can be used for any number of phenomenon, not just in reading, but we use it in reading to talk about that kind of downward spiral that can happen when kids are moving into 4th, 5th grade and they're not reading as much as we want them to be. Because that's where that big shift in vocabulary acquisition happens. You can see it is this kind of downward spiral. They sort of all lead to each other. But it really, the biggest piece is it affects that vocabulary. Now, when we're talking about learning new words, we want to make sure that we're always doing it in context, because that's how our brain works. We create different synapses, different neural connections within our brain. So if I'm going to learn a new word for the difference between a mug and a cup, I'm going to first talk about, well, what is a cup? Okay, well, then a mug is actually just a cup with a handle, and those ideas are connected together. So you can do this with concrete noun or concrete nouns like a mug. Particularly with little kids, that's kind of where you're going to start. And then as you move up into primary, to kind of move more towards those shades of meaning and all of those words as well. So a couple of things that you guys can do. And so this word wizard one, that's one that I really like to do. You know, you can do it even as a family. If you choose sort of a word of the day or a word of the week for the family, something that you're all going to learn together and you're going to really practice, you can have it up on the wall at home, on the board, whatever, and talk your way through it. So another really big piece for you guys as parents is that world knowledge piece. And if we go back to that balancing act, two of the biggest ones up there are vocabulary and world knowledge. World knowledge is really, really important before we go on, because we want to make sure that our kids have some sort of concept for what they're reading about. So even if they're going to read a new novel, so if I'm an adult reader, I want to pick up a beach read, it's a murder mystery set in the Cold War, I have to have some idea of what happened in the Cold War for my story to be able to make sense. So a couple different things you can do. So this is actually an example from one of the first grade classes we had here, where they were reading the different versions of Cinderella in order to, one, build those reading strategies and all those things that we want them to be doing, but also building that world knowledge in that context. So before they read every version, we learned a little bit about the culture. Where in the world was it? What is that culture like? And then how does that culture then impact the story? And because the plot was very similar throughout every book, the students then had the confidence to really dive deeply into comparing and contrasting the different characters, the plots, all of those different story elements of the story. So you can have a map at home and just talk about the different parts of the world. Every time you watch a movie, where in the world is that happening? So here are a couple things you guys can do. And I know right now we don't get to travel quite as much as we'd probably like to, but you can even just take little trips around Hong Kong. Try different restaurants, try different cuisines, look at that world map, try to read different books from different cultures. That descriptive piece is really important as well, and that vocabulary is going to build up into that descriptive piece. So here's something you can do at home. This was just a silly question that got thrown out, and then the kids were invited to write a different answer or a list of answers for this question. You can also just take an ordinary object like a spoon. I've actually had students who could write an entire descriptive paragraph just about a mundane object like a spoon. You can talk about what it looks like. And when we're talking about what it looks like, there's the shape, there's the feel, there are the colors. You can make comparisons to something else it might look like. There's all kinds of ways that you can describe simple things. But a couple of things you guys can do at home. So these games, guess who, that's one that really any age is going to like, but that categories is really important as well. And that can be where, if I say, tell me all of the animals you can think of, or tell me all of the colors you can think of, and have them sort of work their way through. That's really going to help with that rapid recall of words as well. Of course, there's the complexity side of language. We want to make sure that the language that we're using is getting more and more complex as they grow. And there's a very clear development to what language development looks like. How should a 2-year-old be speaking versus a 4-year-old? And you want to make sure that you're kind of pushing them along with the kinds of words that they're using, moving them from just phrases to more complete sentences, that they're asking questions properly, all of these things. Of course, as they get really into about 2nd, 3rd grade, they're going to have that language base to start to understand puns. And puns are actually quite tricky because there are a lot of layers to the language that you have to understand in order for them to be funny and make sense. And along with puns, we always have those idiomatic phrases as well, which is really important, particularly if you are talking about kids who maybe aren't as native to that home culture of that idiom. Those are things that might need to be explicitly taught. So again, as a family, you can have an idiom of the week that you all learn and practice. So 2 of the biggest things you guys can do for parents about that complexity. The first one on the left is modeling, right? So you are the expert speakers, right? You get to say these complete sentences. You get to describe things in more complex ways. And the other big one is mirroring. So that's really important, particularly as kids are going through that learning the language phase. if you ever hear your kids ask a question and maybe they swap the words of the order around, or they said something not quite right, you don't necessarily need to call it out and say, oh, that's not right, but you can mirror it back to them. So you can repeat it back to them in the order or the way that it's supposed to be, and then get them to say it back to you. And just the kind of little nudges like that along the way will move them in the right direction. So I just wanted to take a minute and have you guys kind of reflect a little bit on your own families, on your own kids, maybe jot down a few notes if there's something on the language side that you might want to try at home. All right, so kind of going into a few other tips. Some of these are just kind of general tips that you might use really with any age. So we'll kind of go through a few of these, and all of these are kind of the big common questions that I get from parents a lot, as well as just some things that you can be working on at home. So one of the first questions that I get a lot from parents, I think this is really important, particularly now that we are doing so much online, is that big question between actually picking up a pencil and writing it by hand versus using the computer. You know, I know with our online learning now, we are kind of being pushed to use the computer more and more, and that's great. And the computer is absolutely a skill that we want our kids to be learning and becoming comfortable with, but the importance of still having that pencil in your hand is really, really important. There's tons of research that shows how when we're physically writing by hand, one, it helps connect those neural pathways a lot more strongly than it would if you're just learning the letter sounds. So particularly really up until about grade 3 or 4, I'd say the handwriting, and I don't mean practicing handwriting as in making the letters look nice, I mean actually writing by hand is really, really important, because you're tying together what the letter looks like, how your muscle moves, what sound it makes, what words it goes into, all of that's really important. Also, writing by hand really helps build what's called that orthographic memory, which is your memory of how words look on the page. So when we talk about kids being good spellers, there are many pieces to that puzzle, but one of them is that strong orthographic memory, which comes a lot from physically writing by hand and reading as much as possible. Now, we don't have quite as much research yet to show the impact of reading off of a screen versus reading an actual book, but I think anecdotally, and some of the first research that's just starting to come out is showing us that, you know, Kindles and such are great because they give us access to more books, but as much as possible, if we can have that paper-based book in our hands, it really helps that learning to read process, particularly when we're talking about that learning to read versus that shift then to reading to learn. One of the other big things that you guys can do at home as parents is be the expert reader. You know, so those read alouds are really, really important. You want to make sure that you are sharing books with your kids as much as possible. And there's a couple reasons for that. So first of all, they need to hear what it's like to sound like a fluent reader, particularly when you're in those kind of first years and they're sort of stumbling along their words, they're not there yet. So they need to have that hearing of what it sounds like. Now, I will say, if your kids will let you read to them, I mean, as long as they will let you read to them, read to them. If they will let you read to them all the way through secondary, go for it, do it. They probably won't, but as long as they will let you, definitely keep going. And you can then transition to audiobooks when they get a little bit older and they don't necessarily want to sit and read with you anymore. But the other really big point, one of the other big points about reading with your kids is you can also be sharing with them more complex material than they are able to read themselves. So intellectually, they might be able to understand some of these books that you're reading with them. They have the maturity to think about the characters, to think about all these different pieces, but they're not fluent enough readers yet to actually read the book for themselves. So as you're reading through with them, you want to make sure that you're kind of stopping and asking some questions and going through it. So a couple of things that you guys can do. So this column over on the left with the shared readings, the read alouds, these are different ways that you can be sharing books with your kids. So the shared reading is where you are sharing the book together. So this is a really great way to do it when you have kids who are just starting to break that alphabetic code, but they're not fluent readers yet. So reading a longer book is it's taxing. They don't have the stamina yet to get all the way through a long book, but you could be swapping off pages. So you read this page, mommy reads this page, or you tell me about what's happening here, and then I'm going to read the words. So you could be sharing that experience of looking through the book. Read alouds is really important as well, and that's where you're just reading to them. And for those kids who aren't reading yet, you can be bringing out a lot of that language just by looking at the illustrations. So I might spend a good 5 minutes just looking at the pictures on the page before I even read the words. Those authentic reading experiences are really important, and that's what I was talking about earlier about actually having that physical book in front of you. It makes it so much more authentic. They're real books. And that fluency piece is really, really important. So when we're becoming a fluent reader, if you think back to that balancing act that I was showing you, the scale, that ultimate goal is that instant word recognition. When kids are learning to read, even as adults, if we come across a new word, it could be anywhere as much as 20 times where we need to accurately see that word, decode it, and understand it before that mental image of the word gets stuck in our brain, that instant word recognition, that automaticity. So that's why repeated readings are great. So especially up until 3rd grade, if they want to read that same book again and again and again, that's okay. I say definitely go for it. Some of the things that you guys can be doing as you're reading the books with them is, of course, stop and ask questions. And I've got a few slides that I'll show you here in a bit with some specific questions that you could be asking. But really, and also helping them make connections and making predictions. So that's that thinking piece of it that's coming in. So making connections either between themselves and the book, between the world, or between other books that they've read. And predictions is kind of stop and thinking what's going to happen next. That inference making is really important. And again, these are skills you can be reading, that they can be building even when they're not reading yet. And those are going to be really important as part of that once they become those fluent readers. So some of the questions that you can ask. So these questions are really ones that she'll use in 2 ways. So either you've read part of it, you're going to stop and talk about what's happened, or you finish the story and you're going to go back and kind of summarize. You can also be talking about those story elements if you're reading a narrative or a fiction piece. So the characters, the setting, the plot, the problems, the solution, all of those big pieces. I really like these. A lot of times I'll have these sort of I wonder questions as well. So you've read part of the story and then it's like, I wonder. And that I wonder question could be about anything. If you're reading a book about bees, maybe that I wonder is something else you want to learn about bees. Or maybe your I wonder, like it says here, I wonder why the author, what he meant by that, or why did the author choose this word or put in that picture, whatever it might be. So these are some really important ones too, because as fluent readers, so as an adult, you always stop and think, do I understand what I'm reading? And I know I do this a lot. I'll get home at the end of the day and I'll have a huge stack of books that I think I'm going to read through. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to read for 20 minutes and I'm going to read this chapter. And I'll get a few pages in and I'll have realized that I didn't understand or I didn't remember anything that I read. And maybe it's because I'm tired or I'm thinking about something else. But as a fluent reader, I recognize that and then I can do something about it. I can either put the book away and come back to it another day. I can go back and I can read it again. These are things that oftentimes need to be explicitly pointed out to kids. Reading is understanding. If I can't stop and talk about what I've read and explain it to you, I'm not reading. I need to go back and read it again. So this visualizing piece is really important as well. Because really while we're reading, you want to be creating that sort of mental image in your brain, right? Which is why if you've read a book and you love, love, love that book and they make a movie of it, the movie's never as good, right? Because it's never quite the same. So that's why helping them build that mental image is really important. And I see some questions are coming through, so thank you for those, guys. We'll get to those here in a little bit once we get to the end. So this is really important too, that text importance. So really up until about first grade, if I stop and I ask a kid what's happened, I'm going to expect them to tell me pretty much everything that happened in that story. And that's kind of what I want to see. What I am looking for is that they're telling it to me in the proper sequence and that they're at least getting most of the details in there. That's kind of the first level of being able to recount or retell a story. Of course, the next part is actually figuring out what was the important bits. And so that's where these kind of questions can come in. So really, you know, by the end of first grade to the middle of first grade, with some guiding questions, I'm going to hope that my kids are going to be able to start to get to that point where they're going to say, oh, well, I think maybe this was the important part. All right, so making inferences. This is probably one of the hardest things you can do. Because to make an inference, you are taking what you read plus what you know, and you got to put it together somehow and come up with an inference. So this is another reason why that background knowledge is so important. You cannot inference unless you have a good base of understanding about the topic or the region or whatever it is that story or that nonfiction piece is about. But again, this is tricky. And by about, you know, so with pictures, you can start with inferencing with pictures. So even just looking at the pictures in the book, you can start to say, oh, well, I see, you know, the character is doing this and I know they're on a farm. What do you think that means? But as far as just purely inferencing from the story that they read, that's something that you probably aren't going to see independently until at least second grade. They're going to need a lot of guiding questions to get there. And even then, it's going to be pretty kind of basic inferencing. So these are those connection pieces that I was talking about earlier. There are 3 different kinds of connections. So I just read a story reminding me of something that happened when I was a kid. Or I just read a nonfiction piece. Oh, it reminded me of that news article I read last week. And then that text to world. So I know this was happening with the character. That reminds me, I know that that's a common occurrence in people that live in those sorts of places. So again, these are those kind of leading questions you can use to get your kids to think through these different levels. So 2 of the other big things as parents that you guys can do is building in that passion for reading and giving them that opportunity. And that, you know, that opportunity and that passion, a lot of that kind of comes from that family and that home culture. If it's just a part of your family week, to all sit down and read books, or they see that big brother is always reading or that daddy's always reading, it's going to become a part of their life. That opportunity is really important as well. You want to make sure that it is a regular part of their routine. So by the end of first grade, you want to kind of be pushing for 20 minutes of sustained independent reading time. And then you want to be building that up. So as they move up into, you know, kind of 4th, 5th grade, I really would be looking more for 30, 40 minutes. And I'm not, you know, ideally they're doing that every day, because if we remember, reading is the best way for them to learn new vocabulary, the thinking skills, all of these things. But I know realistically that's not always the case. But if you can shoot for 20 minutes of independent reading time every day, that's going to really, really help. And for most kids, they're going to need someone to sit there with them. So it might even be, you know, a lot of times in the classroom, if I say, all right, guys, we're going to do, you know, some sustained silent reading, I'm going to get my book and I'm going to sit down with them. Because if I don't have my book in front of me as well, I can guarantee probably about half the kids, they might read for 5 minutes and then they're going to want to do something else. But if they see that I'm still reading, it kind of motivates them to keep going as well. This is a really, really important one. So actually, when we talk about reading development, there are very clear stages, and I'll be talking about that more in my talk later today at 6 o'clock. But you really want to keep in mind, it's not the age of the kid. It's where they are in that developmental continuum. Some kids get there more quickly. Some kids get there more slowly. Some might kind of take a long time to get through those first couple of stages, and then they're really quick with the last ones. So you want to keep in mind, it's not how old they are. It's not what everyone else is doing in the class. It's where they are in that continuum. It's also really important to keep in mind that, and this isn't just happening here in Hong Kong, it's happening globally. But the kinds of stuff that many schools are expecting their kids to do is way sooner than science says they're supposed to. And sometimes that can be as much as 2 or 3 years. So for example, some of the kindergartens here, their K2 program in some ways is like a grade 2 program. So you want to keep that in mind as well. They might just need more time to get there. So this is really important as well. And that comes back to that repeated reading that I mentioned earlier. I get this question a lot from parents. Oh, she just wants to read the same book over and over and over again. You know what? That's okay. And I would rather see that than have her not be reading at all. Particularly if she's still learning to read, because she's comfortable with it. She's building that automaticity with the words. And then she can use that comfort to then build on to other ones. So one kind of great way to sort of encourage those kids who are reading those same books again to look out for something new is to find books in a series, or to find things that are very similar to what they're reading, but something new. And as a side note, I really, really like chapter book series, particularly for that kind of, once they're over that first hump of reading and they're actually starting to kind of read and they're not quite fluent yet, but they're getting there. Chapter book series are really great because they're already familiar with the characters. So every time they pick up a new book, it's kind of like picking up a friend, and it's not this whole new scary experience. This is another really important thing to remember. So kind of going back to one of my first slides, talking about how reading and writing are not naturally occurring human phenomenons. These are things that we as a society have created. So English has decided that I can take a circle and a stick and a dot and a line, and I can move it around in a bunch of different ways. And for some reason that makes a totally different letter, which has a totally different sound. And sometimes that one letter might have multiple sounds. So this idea of reversals, it's super common. It's not really something to worry about. If a kid, the only times I would worry is one, if they can't see the difference. So if they have written a D instead of a B, and I then write beside them or show them a picture of a B, and they can't see that they're different, that's a bit of a red flag. The other time I might be worried is if it's not improving. So with those kind of gentle reminders, with continued practice, they are consistently reversing them. That's something to look into as well. But in general, really, even through first grade, it's pretty normal to see this kind of stuff. Another big question I get a lot from parents is about graphic novels. I really, really like graphic novels. I will say there is a difference between a graphic novel and a cartoon, though, or a comic book. So a graphic novel, it's a novel. It has the same depth and complexity of plot and characters that you would find in a novel. It just happens to have some pictures in there. And I can't remember who first came up with this term, but a lot of people call graphic novels the great equalizer, because you can read really complex, mature books at a little bit lower reading level. So you're still building all of those wonderful thinking skills and vocabulary and all the things you want, but it's a book that they're excited to read, and it's a book that they can access. Another really great thing about graphic novels is there's a number of authors who've taken all of these classics and they've turned them into graphic novels. So you can read the Odyssey in 4th grade because it's now a graphic novel. So kind of the last section I wanted to walk through with you guys is what quality instruction looks like. So we've kind of talked about little different pieces of what you guys at home can be looking for, but to kind of bring us back to the very beginning when I was sharing with you Scarborough's reading rope, you want to make sure, so obviously there's parts that you guys are going to be doing, that background knowledge, that vocabulary, a bit of that language structure, that's kind of where a big part of not the responsibility, but a big part of where you guys as parents can step in and support. A lot of this other stuff, you want to be looking for quality instruction. And that can come from school, it can come from somewhere like Baker and Bloom, but you want to make sure that the people who are teaching your kids how to read, or even once they become fluent readers, who are then teaching them those deeper levels, really know what they're looking for and know how to do it. And making sure that there's a lot of those missing links. So particularly down here on that word recognition site, there are a number of, and again, this is not just Hong Kong, it's happening all over the world. I've come across so many schools again and again and again who are not teaching these things. And it really is a shame because they are essential. These are things that have to be taught for that kid to be an accomplished reader or writer. And one thing I actually haven't really talked too much about was that what is called the 4th grade slump. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in my talk later this evening. But that's where, and if you think about the requirements sort of moving from lower primary to upper primary, the shift is huge. And what happens a lot is the kids that don't have all of these pieces really well in place, by the time they get down the road, the school expects them to be up here. They expect them to pick up a textbook and understand it. They expect them to read a poem and analyze it. But if they don't have all of those little pieces that have been tightly braided together, they're not going to be able to do it. And that's why it's quite common to see moving into upper primary, we see kids who they've been doing fine. But then all of a sudden you see that academic dip. So some of the things to look for in quality instruction. So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. The ones I would like to mention, so that explicit teaching, that really is on that, a lot of that decoding piece and the structure of language. And again, I'll be talking a little bit more about this in my talk later, but how to use Latin roots and how to use morphemes and all of that to help build that deeper understanding of the language in order to then turn it into better understand your reading and produce better writing. That text type knowledge is really important. And this is another big one that I see again and again moving into grade 3, grade 4. They don't really truly know the difference between narrative or persuasive or opinion. And so they're not able to produce the different kinds of writings that they're expected to. So just before I get to all of the questions, just to kind of give you guys an overview of our offerings here at Baker & Bloom for the fall. So this one-on-one and coaching and private courses, as I quickly mentioned at the very beginning, these are ones that are 100% dedicated to what that kid or those group of kids needs. All of our classes are capped at 6, but especially now that we're online, it's really more like 4. They tend to be quite small, but those one-on-one and private classes are even smaller. We also have a couple of other talks coming up that you guys might be interested in. So later today at 6, as I mentioned a few times, I'll be talking a little bit more about our Inspired Reader to Writer program, but really talking mainly about those stages of reading development and what it looks like at each age. Tomorrow we have a wonderful talk by one of our teachers, Lenore Look, who's actually an author herself. And then later on tomorrow evening, Miss May will be talking about STEM. And then we've got a couple of more secondary focused ones on Thursday about IB English and using those internships. And then Friday evening, we have an info session about that new school that we're building, which is really exciting. And then Saturday is all about admissions. So I will stop sharing for now, and I will take some of these questions. So the first one, thank you, from Kim, talking about pictures or videos when explaining vocabulary. Absolutely. Particularly if you're talking about those kind of easy ones, the concrete nouns, right? Why am I going to describe what a mug is when I can just show you, hey, this is a mug? If you have kids who are growing up in multiple languages as well, build on that. If they already know that concept or that word in another language, they already know what it means. They already understand it. All they have to do is just attach that new word to it. So yeah, I would say absolutely use visuals. Yeah, so with those pictures, and that's a great question about kind of hindering those inferential thinking skills. You want to imagine all of these things kind of as tools, right? So your ideas, imagine you're building a building. You've got that scaffolding supporting the building. Eventually you want that scaffolding to fall away and you want the building to stand tall by itself. So if you need to show some pictures along the way, I do this a lot. Even the other day, one of the kids, we were reading a book about swans, and he was like, oh yeah, I know what a swan is. But then we started talking about geese. And I was trying to describe to him the difference between a goose and a swan, and I just showed him a picture. And he was able to immediately say, oh yeah, and then he could connect it to this game he was playing and all these other things. So you want to use the words to describe it as well, but it's okay to back it up with a picture or a video. So yeah, so with the graphic novels, I mean, with their reading diet, you want to make sure that it's a balance. So while I love graphic novels, I wouldn't necessarily want to see a kid only reading graphic novels. So a couple things that you can do to encourage them is one, having that opportunity. So allow them make sure they have access to other books. You can make a little chart, so this is the book you're reading now, and then the next book you're going to read, let's write down something else, and have them record what kind of book was it, what was the text type, and sort of push them. And then after they've read, 4 graphic novels, you might stop and say, hey, look at your reading log. I've noticed something about the last 4 books you've read. What do you notice? And be like, well, maybe it's time to try something else. But I know you really like graphic novels because the characters are, do a lot of action. Here's this book I found where the character also is very active. Yeah, so kind of moving through. Yeah, so just really quickly to say about the curriculum. So we use the American demarcation for grades. So grade 3 would be so G3 is American grade 3. So that would be 9 years old. But it's not necessarily the curriculum that we use. That's just the age demarcation that we use. And really with all of our classes, again, going back to that idea of the stage, not the age, every time we meet a new student, we do a diagnostic and we find out exactly where that kid is in these different areas, and then we recommend classes based on them. So yeah, so for those younger guys, so the kind of 4 to 6 years old, decoding is going to be that first level. And that's where those repeated readings are really, really important. So you want to make sure that they're reading the same book a couple of times. And every time you read, it's going to have a different purpose. Your first purpose is to just read the words on the page, to accurately decode. So make sure that they're not dropping a letter, that they're not inserting words. They're just accurately reading whatever's on the page. That's the first time I read through. And you might stop and read that same page a couple times if they need to. My second read is going to be for comprehension. So then I'm going to go back through, and it might be after every sentence. I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask them questions. Hey, what just happened? What character did we just meet? Why do you think the character did that? All right, let's read the next one. And then that final piece, the final reading, and that final reading could be a number of times. It's going to be that fluency piece. And that's where you're reading it again and again and again until you can read it without thinking. You can read it as if you're talking to a friend. So when kids are still in that decoding phase, it's important to be building that connections between what the word looks like and what the word means, but it's also really, really important to be building that overall language base. So even before you start reading a new book, let's say it's going to be set on a farm, pull up a Google image of what a farm looks like and talk about it. This is a barn, these are what these animals are called, this is what a baby goose is called. So you're really activating that background knowledge and you're getting them used to all that vocabulary that they're then going to see in the book. Yeah, so again, that question about nonfiction, so the question was how to kind of increase their interest in nonfiction for kids who are really just interested in Harry Potter and those kind of books. So again, so a couple things. So one thing I always like to keep in mind, when kids are reading outside of schoolwork, we want to make sure that you keep in mind how hard they're working during the school day. Particularly now that a lot of it is online. Anytime they go to school, it's hard, it's challenging. They're spending all day long, they're thinking, they're reading, they're writing, they're talking. By the time they get home, especially those younger guys, or if school's hard, their brains are pretty tired, right? So you want to make sure that the kind of reading they're doing, the kind of instruction they're getting after school is what they're comfortable with and what's actually going to help meet them where they are and move them along. So really, if kids are reading after school and after other classes at all, I think that's wonderful. But you can definitely be encouraging the other types through, I would say, kind of just talking with them about the books that they like and make sure that they have access to it. So, again, nonfiction, you can find nonfiction about, things that you might see in Harry Potter, those more sort of fantastical ones. There are nonfiction books out there about wizards, about all of these things. So you can kind of gently be pushing them in the other direction. And yeah, so one more question about that, explaining the words in other languages. Absolutely. So when we talk about language development, or particularly vocabulary acquisition, what you're doing, anytime you learn a new word, you're learning the concept of what that word is. And so even if I learn the word pen, I have this visual image that pops into my mind of a pen. I know what it looks like. I know what I use it for. So if I know that word in another language and I already have that visual construct of what a pen is, all I need to do then is attach that label. So if I was going to go learn Russian, I need to learn the vocabulary in Russian, but I don't need to learn what a character is or what a snowy mountain is. I already know what that is. I'm just learning the new word. Yeah, so another question about the delay between reading and writing. So this talk was really just about reading, but reading and writing go hand in hand. Reading will always come first. And for some kids, there might be as much as a 2-year difference in what they're able to read and what they're able to produce as writers. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Now, when we're talking about writing, another thing you have to keep in mind is writing is pretty much the hardest thing we can do as human beings. It almost takes every single part of our brain working properly in order to get words on a page. So for a lot of kids, particularly when they're in those early years, getting words on the page sometimes, that in and of itself, that's all they can accomplish, right? That's kind of the extent of their brain capacity at that point. But what you can do is teach specific pieces. And again, if you go back to those 4 domains of language, speaking and writing are connected. So if they're speaking in complete sentences, if they're speaking with detailed descriptions, eventually that's going to translate into their writing. But if they're not able to orally produce that quality, it's never going to come out in their writing. So kind of keeping all of those pieces in mind. Writing will always be slower. The oral language has to be there first. And that cognitive load required to write is really, really high. Let's see, I think that's everyone's questions. Let me just scroll back through really quick, see if I missed anything. Yeah, so about writing structure. So there was a question about how to kind of guide kids more in that writing structure piece. A couple different things. So one, that goes back to that text type. So narratives, right? Every narrative pretty much follows the same structure. Of course, some authors get to be a little bit creative with it, but pretty much we have a beginning where we set the stage, we introduce the characters, the events get more and more complicated, there might be little offshoots, but eventually there's a climax, and then it kind of winds down to an end of the story. So teaching that sort of structure, the hero's journey for kids who are a little bit older, where they've got this sort of structure in their mind, that's going to push their writing onto that next level. And working through the different text types as well. So not just, most kids love writing stories, which is wonderful, and I love writing stories as well, but you also have to keep in mind that as they move up into upper primary and into secondary, they're rarely going to be asked to write a story. The things that they're going to be asked to do are use the skills from writing a story, most importantly, that descriptive piece. That's really, really important, and that's one of the big reasons why we do focus on stories with those younger kids, because it builds those descriptive skills. But they're really going to be asked to analyze and write informative pieces. And that's where that structure is really important. You've got to learn how to write a paragraph and then how to stack up those paragraphs into an essay. I think that's all of the questions. I don't know if there are any other questions out there. But if not, I would just like to say, if you have any other questions moving forward, please feel free to email us, reach out. We're more than happy to talk with you guys more. And as I was saying later today, at 6, I'll be talking a little bit more about those stages of reading. So if you're really interested in looking at what it looks like in 1st grade or 6th grade as far as reading, that might be of interest to you. But thank you guys so much for tuning in on this lunchtime, and I will see you later.